Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes? Wonderful. Thank you very much for coming tonight. A couple things before we get started. If you would please take a moment to make sure that your cell phone or other device is silent. Also, after the reading, our speaker will take questions, and then we will have a book sale and signing after that. Thank you again, all, for coming to this very special opening event for this year's Department of English, Rhetoric and Writing reading series, the inaugural reading for the David James Poissant Endowed Creative Prose reading series. My name is Sandra Mead, and I coordinate the department's reading series and teach creative writing here at Berry. This is an exciting year for the literary arts at Berry College, and before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to share just some of our news with you. This fall, we are welcoming our first class of students in our brand new BA in Creative Writing, an innovative program designed to be a national example of undergraduate excellence in the literary arts by combining extensive literary study and studio practice in creative writing with environmental components and with community service. This semester, Berry students are organizing a benefit reading in Rome for Southeast Elementary School and creating an after-school course in creative writing for area teens at Sarah Hightower Library. Berry creative writing majors will also have opportunities not only to attend events such as tonight, but also to interact one-on-one with our visiting writers in and out of the classroom. Tonight's speaker met with no fewer than 3 classes today. Since 2007, Berry has also housed and served as the flagship institution of the Georgia Poetry Circuit, a consortium of Georgia colleges and universities working together to bring 3 poets of national reputation annually to all members' campuses, providing an important access to the literary arts for Georgia residents. Since 2007, the GPC has hosted well over 200 free poetry readings across the state and has many classroom sessions, bringing together undergraduate and professional creative writers. In my capacity as director of the Georgia Poetry Circuit, later this fall, I will be formally announcing the launch of a new program that will expand opportunities for Georgia poetry and audiences still further. The Georgia Poetry Circuit Georgia Poets Initiative. This initiative is a registry of Georgia's best poets who will donate their time to give a reading at a Georgia college or university during each academic year for no stipend. More than 30 poets from a dozen Georgia institutions of higher learning, as well as independent writers, have already signed on to volunteer for the program, including the retiring Poet Laureate of the United States, Emory Professor Natasha Tremblay. Finally, tonight's event begins a new reading series that will bring a noted writer of fiction or creative nonfiction to Berry campus each year in perpetuity once fully endowed. Each year's Poissant visiting writer will give a free reading open to the college and local community and will lead a master class for Berry creative writing students. I would like to take this opportunity to express my deepest thanks to those who have already joined the team as early major donors to the Poissant Fund, Al and Jean Cahill and Rick Lynn. It is now my very great honor and truly my joy to introduce to you David James Poissant. James. Jamie is a 2001 graduate of Berry College. completing his student teaching at Pembroke High. He taught high school for 1 year at Sprayberry and Marietta, then 3 more years at Grayson in Gwinnett County. During this period, 2 or 3 years after graduating, Jamie, who had been my Visine student, visited, bringing a short story he'd recently written, seeking feedback for revision. I remember being struck by how accomplished it was, how moving and beautifully written. The only advice I could offer Jamie that day was keep writing. Luckily for us, Jamie planned to do just that. Going back to graduate school to the University of Arizona, where he earned an MFA in creative writing, and then to the University of Cincinnati, where he earned a PhD in English and comparative literature. Jamie now teaches in the MFA program at the University of Central Florida and is a critically acclaimed short story writer. His stories and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, the Chicago Tribune, Glimmer Train, the New York Times, Plowshares, the Southern Review, and elsewhere, and have been included in the New Stories of the South and Best of American Voices Anthologies. His writing has been awarded the Matt Clark Prize, the George Garrett Fiction Award, the Roquefort Fiction Chapbook Prize, and the Alice White Reeves Memorial Award from the National Society of Arts and Letters, as well as prestigious fiction awards from the Atlantic, Playboy, and the Chicago Tribune. His debut short story collection, The Heaven of Animals, was published by Simon & Schuster in March 2014. He is currently at work on a novel, Class, Order, Family, which is forthcoming from Simon & Schuster as well. Jamie lives in Orlando, Florida, with his wife, Marla, also a Bears fan, and their twin daughters. Writing for the New York Times, Rebecca Lee describes The Heaven of Animals as wide and beautiful, praising Jamie's ability to manage his characters' lives with precision, intelligence, and clarity. Her single hesitancy that Poissant can be preoccupied with forgiveness. We should all have such flaws. But this need his characters do so often embody is ultimately about what's behind the desire for forgiveness, that most central human concern, the need for connection. Jamie's collection takes its title from a poem by James Dickey, who, though recognized as a major 20th century American poet, remains perhaps better known for his novel Deliverance. In his poem, The Heaven of Animals, Dickey imagines a heaven where animals arrive beyond their knowing, where their instincts wholly bloom, whether they are predators who hunt with claws and teeth grown perfect, or prey, who, though trembling, walk under the tree where destruction crouches, where they fall, they are torn, but where they rise, they walk again. Dickey here celebrates a fantasy world of damage without consequence, one of automatic redemption. But that world is not ours, and it is not the one of Jamie Poissant's stories. These characters are flawed, as we all are. These are human beings for whom consequence is real, who remain awkward and graceless in their often failed attempts to connect. About writing fiction, Jamie has said, the best you can do is present a character fully, with compassion, and to hope that same compassion is extended from the reader toward the character as well. For me, he said, it all comes down to empathy. This sense of connection, then, that so many of the characters are missing, is enacted through the storytelling itself. In this way, for the reader, these stories are both realistic and redemptive. abiding ability for empathy is part of what makes Jamie a good person and a great writer. In review, Jamie Poissant's short stories have been favorably compared with the very best artists of the genre. In a Star Therapist review, for instance, his voice was described as rueful and kind, akin to both Anton Chekhov and Raymond Carver in humane spirit and technical mastery. Truly, you are about to hear one of the most gifted short story writers in contemporary American fiction. The Heaven of Animals marks just the beginning of Jamie's career, but what a beginning. It is fitting that tonight we have gathered in this chapel where, in 1985, James Dickey gave Berry College's inaugural Thompson Wilson lecture. It is my great honor to have had the opportunity to name our new endowed reading series for this brilliant and compassionate young writer and teacher, and my very great happiness to introduce you to him today. Please welcome David James Poissant.
Trying to make me cry. Wow. This is really something. Thank you. Thank you, Sandy. When Sandy asked me last year if she could name a reading series after me, all I could say was yes, of course. I'm deeply honored. I'm so glad to be back for the first time in 13 years. I did my undergraduate here. My wife did her undergraduate here. My brother did his undergraduate here, and it's an honor to be back and to be in this chapel. Thank you to Sandy. Thank you to the English department. Thank you to Berry College. So it has been 13 years. I was telling Sandy, I'll tell you a quick story because I owe someone here a public apology. When I was here, there was a program called the Berry Bike Program. And there were a couple dozen of these red and white bikes. You couldn't mistake them for other bikes. And last night after Sandy dropped me off at the rooms where I'm staying, I decided to walk around campus because it's changed so much. When I was here, you didn't have the rec center, you didn't have the science building, or a number of the dorms, and I wanted to see the campus. And so I thought I found a Berry bike. So if you were the owner of a red and white bike that was missing last night between 10 and 11 o'clock, I did return it to the exact spot from which I borrowed it. And you should get a bike chain. I'm really happy to be here. When Sandy told me that I would be a cultural events credit, I thought that was the highlight. And then I saw my name today on the Stallwell Weekly. That's when I knew I had made it. As Sandy said, the collection is here. It is for sale. But I met with a number of students today, and I read from the collection, and I know some of you have already read the book, and so I wanted to do something new. And so I'm going to take a chance, and I'm going to read a totally new story. It's not 100% yet, but my thinking here is that if you don't like it, think how much better everything in the book is. And so I'll be happy to sign copies after the reading. It's a new story. It's called Minotaur. Now, if you don't know the myth of the Minotaur, this was the creature who had the torso and legs of a man, but the head and tail of a bull. And it was the son of Pasiphae. Let me see how you say her name. Pasiphae. It's a really messed up myth. So I I've become really interested in mythology, and some of the work in my collection has to do with realism, and some of it is kind of fantastical. And in my novel, I've been writing a very realist novel, and so as kind of a release valve for that, I've been writing this really weird stuff. So you're going to get to hear the weird tonight. So this is a story called Minotaur. It's told from the point of view of a girl. So if it helps, picture me as a girl as I read this. So this is Minotaur, and then if I have time, I'll read a short essay after this, but this might do it. All right, so this is Minotaur. His nose was velvet, wet and septum ringed. One ear chewed off or almost at the lobe. His chin was whiskery. His breath was rank. His fingernails were nickels forged and hammered to a shine, thumbnails like quarters, filth caked under each. The flesh of his head so dark it seemed to ride like water under sun. He didn't talk, but happy his tail wagged. It wasn't much of a tail, but he could wag it. Could wag a book off a shelf. Could wag a vase onto the floor. Is only one of the many reasons we kept him outside. The day Dad brought him home, Mom said, "What on earth?" was like, "I don't even think so." A minotaur, she said, is not a pet. "Mom," I said, "you said that about the raccoon." It was true. That summer, I'd found a nest, the mother dead, cocooned in ants and maggots. One baby lived. It shook, thin and small-seeming in its fur, and I brought the raccoon home, at which point Mom had called animal control. They'd killed the animal and tested it for rabies to make sure I didn't need shots. Mom never told me this, but that's how it works. I knew. I'd learned it from TV, and TV never lies. I've been waiting to play this card, the "you killed my last pet, so can't I at least keep the Minotaur on a trial basis" card. But as it turned out, I didn't have to. Dad put his foot down. He didn't do it often, but when he did, his boots rocked the floorboards. "But what if he eats Cassandra?" my mother said, gesturing at the Minotaur, who, say what you want about their intelligence, I think he knew we were talking about him, and I was mortified. My father gave me the once-over and shook his head. "Nobody is eating anybody," he said. "Cassandra's a big girl. She'll be fine." I wasn't. I was in 5th grade and small for my age. Other girls were getting tall and getting their periods, getting their bras snapped by boys, while I stayed short and flat and periodless. Each morning, waking, I checked, hoping, praying for that Rorschach of blood that meant what Mom called my womanhood, but all I ever got was white cotton. "But what about his," my mother trailed off, then gestured between the Minotaur's legs. I looked. I'd seen my father's, seen it all, and had not been impressed. A body is a body. Appendages is all we are. Skin bags of meat and bone. Dad rolled his eyes. "It's not like he's a horse," my father said. "You want to talk about dongs." But my mother cut him off. She almost never called my father by his name, but she did. "Louis Henry," she said. "You be quiet." Normally she preferred pet names: Darling, Honey Pie, Love. That day, the day Dad got the Minotaur, my parents watched each other across the family room. This was a battle of wills removed from spoken language. A battle fought purely on a telepathic plane. Mom scowled, teeth toothpaste white. A dental hygienist, she was big on oral hygiene and on floss. By now, the Minotaur was squatting in one corner, defecating behind the couch. His dumps were legendary in both stink and girth. He could take the finish off the floor if you didn't get them up within a few minutes. By Christmas, Our floor would have to be sanded and refinished, a costly job that would get my father the "I told you so" talk of the century from my mother and those flashing teeth. My parents stood that day, eyes locked, and Mom went to the bedroom. That night, she didn't come out. Dad slept on the couch. If you don't know what a minotaur is, that's okay. I didn't either before Dad brought ours home. Basically, a minotaur is a man with the head of a bull, or a bull with the body of a man, depending on how you want to look at it. They're rare, not indigenous to Earth, and not recommended by many to make great household pets. I asked Dad once where he got ours, and he said, "From the guy who sells Gremlins." "That's a movie," I said. To which my father said, "Is it? And which conversation I went to bed with fresh things to nightmare about?" People don't write books on the care and feeding of family minotaurs the way they do for beagles and hamsters. I think because there aren't that many to go around, or else because we had the only one. But here are the basics. To keep a minotaur, you need patience, access to large quantities of undercooked meat, and also a labyrinth. Free-range minotaurs require miles of maze, but domesticated ones can thrive in cozier warrens, say the books. Online experts recommend 10 acres, and we had half that. But the land beyond our back property line was protected wetlands, and though technically you're not supposed to build on those, no one checked the bogs out back of our house. No one knew that land wasn't ours. This was Oviedo, Orlando's northern rural cousin. Think swamps. Think cypress domes and Spanish moss. Think gators and things that slither. 2-3 times a year, Dad shoveled the heads off snakes stuck into the house. Once a year, he took out an alligator, pistol to the head. Those months, we ate alligator tail meat some new way at every meal. And if Christmas was close, relatives could expect belts of skin or necklaces of teeth. We had the land then, but not the maze. Dad wanted only the best for our minotaur, so he took extra shifts, smuggled lumber and mortar from the job sites he worked. He already had clothes and tools, the hard hat, auger, gloves, and table saw, the tool belts, levels, jointers, planers, drills. The first month, the minotaur lived in the bathroom, which was rough on the bathroom. The towel bar did not make it a day. The sink was next, first the faucet, then the knobs. We never found the knob for cold, which I guess lodged somewhere in the minotaur's gut. He not infrequently gored the shower curtain, and more than once I caught him sharpening his horns on the porcelain clawfoot tub. An antique, Mom said she'd be livid if he wrecked, and for which she was livid. "No more minotaur," Mom said. "Not in this house." That day, Dad was just home from work. His mustache drooped, and there was drywall dust in the hair of his arms. He didn't say a word, just went to the garage. He returned with a sledgehammer, moved to the front yard, knocked the driveway's basketball goalpost down, cut off the backboard, dragged the pole to the backyard, and using a post hole digger and quick dry concrete, sunk the post deep into the earth and tethered Taurus, by now we'd named him, to the pole with 3 padlocks and a length of chain. There followed what I think of as the sad days. Tori's velvety nose cracked, and flies laid eggs in his ears. He scratched a patch the shape of Africa from his hairy side, and when he breathed beneath that fleshy continent, I saw his ribs. Some days, I'd come home from school to find him tangled and choking. He got worms. He dug an orbit's trench around his post. "Winter is coming," my mother said. "He can't live like this." "You're the one who wanted him out of the house," my father said, then backed down before my mother said anything more. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. Maybe it was the snort she let loose that sounded not entirely unlike a bull's. Maybe it was the fact that 2 months before, my father had brought home the son of Pacific home to live with us, and was only just beginning to recognize the challenges implicit in such a contract. Whatever the case, My father redoubled his efforts, then redoubled them again, and before long, a ramshackle maze took shape in our backyard. The walls stood cobbled together with all kinds of building materials, plywood and particle board, drywall and deck sheeting. But the perimeter was mortar and brick. The day we introduced Tory to the labyrinth, his tail wagged like a metronome. He snorted and pawed the earth with one deeply calloused human foot. He charged the first wall, ran through it, hit the ground, and flailed. Blood marooned the grass. A broken wing of particle board filled one eye, splintery and unforgiving. Dad called the local big animal vet, Dr. Solomon, who'd only ever worked on horses, cows, and the occasional alpaca, but who came to our house and removed the wood. The Minotaur removed the doctor's arm. There followed a long and lugubrious civil suit that briefly attracted local media attention. The Devil's 2 acres, the Orlando Weekly headline read. Strangers showed up at the house asking to see our demon. A few Catholics camped out on the front lawn. They held signs, poster board markered and pinned to paint stir sticks. Sin against nature, one sign read, and another, get behind me, Minotaur. Neighbors lobbied to have Tory locked up or dragged away, but there was no homeowners association statutes banning Minotaurs, just pit bulls and Dobermans. One woman called animal control, but they wouldn't touch him, seeing as they weren't sure whether technically a half-guy, half-bull hybrid qualified as an animal. In the end, the judge threw out Doc Solomon's case on the grounds that if a vet got bit by a dog he'd failed to muzzle, that was no more the owner's fault than the vet's. I took umbrage at the comparison of Tory to a dog. Our Minotaur was way smarter than an old poodle. He was toddler smart, or dolphin smart maybe. I stood in the courtroom when the judge said that. I was angry, ready to defend my only friend, but Dad pulled me back onto the bench hard. In time, the media buzz died down. People stopped coming by. The Catholics left our lawn, and things returned to normal. Tory running his maze, Tory eating from wheelbarrowfuls of ground round we left just inside the labyrinth's padlocked doors, Tory pooping his great piles of steaming, grass-incinerating poop. We got into a routine, Tory and me. I'd come home from school, unbolt the doors, and join the Minotaur in his maze. This was when the maze still spanned 2 acres, 2 football fields in size. Back when you could do the maze in half an hour, even if you got turned around a few times. Some days I'd throw a ball and Tory would bring it back wet with his drool, and other days he'd take my hand and together we'd negotiate the corridors. There were all kinds of things to find inside the labyrinth. A downed kite one day, a football flown from a neighbor's yard the next. A box turtle, shell cracked like the lid of a soft-boiled egg, the inside scooped out. Tory and I didn't talk about that one. He didn't talk, period, but his eyes were searching, and when he looked into yours, you could almost see the man in them, that spark of wanting to talk, not like a dog's, not that fickle, easy will to please or to be loved. No, Tory wanted to be understood. Snapping a tree branch so that I could feel the green, white wood inside, or uncurling an earthworm from the earth, watching me with those big, sad cow eyes, Tory was saying, look around you, Cassandra, look closer, look. Many of the labyrinth walls were aluminum or scrap metal, rust-fringed, edges rippling like frayed pant cuffs, so that you had to watch where you walked and take your corners wide. The Minotaur, blind in one eye from the particle board, was bad at this. His thighs a latticework of scars and fresh cuts that wept red. Weekends, when I had more time, he'd settle into a hollow of mud at the base of the wall, and I'd rub Neosporin ointment up and down his legs. Sometimes, doing this, between his legs would twitch a reflex like at the doctor's when the mallet comes down, and suddenly your shin is in the air. In deference to Mom's crotch worries, Dad had fashioned Tory the Minotaur equivalent of a loincloth. But loincloths are tricky things. Seldom do they stay in place, and when they do, seldom do they satisfactorily hide what's outlined underneath. I'd rub his legs, the cloth would rise, Tory's bull face would flush from brown to pink, and snorting he'd stand and lumber, tail twitching, like a shaking hand, like a finger wagging, "Do not follow me." The summer before 6th grade, the labyrinth grew. The local economy was in the toilet in Florida, and new home construction was on hold. All over the state, developments were unfinished, builders bankrupting, contractors sidelined. My father's work slowed and dropped off entirely. We might have lost our house, might have starved had not my grandfather, Dad's father, a man who'd gotten rich on dot-com stocks and sold just before the bubble burst, died and left my father a sizable inheritance. All of the money went to the labyrinth. With his hours free and seemingly bottomless bank account from which to draw, Dad, to my mother's dismay, threw himself with a renewed zeal at the backyard. Soon, the labyrinth sprawled past our property line and into the swamp. It was messy, difficult work. Dad bought a bobcat and then a bulldozer. He hired day laborers, fit galoshes to their feet and chainsaws to their fists. The men went to work. Trees fell and birds scattered. Herons and egrets and endangered sandhill cranes. From ponds, alligators watched goggle-eyed while anhingas waterside spread their wings. Gaggles of scarlet ibis ran frenzied, and Dad would flush them into the maze where they'd velociraptor in packs until the minotaur had picked them off, one by one. Somewhere during this time, my parents stopped speaking to one another. No longer was my father love or honey pie. He was raised eyebrows and sighs. Mom would come home from work, and rather than talk about her day, which hygienist was newly engaged, which hygienist kids were on honor roll, which hygienist was currently being hit on by the oral surgeon, and did the oral surgeon's wife know or care, Mom would instead cook and plate our dinners and move to the bedroom where she ate alone. I wasn't so young I didn't know that this meant trouble. I'd had my first boyfriend by then, and though we'd only held hands before the relationship disintegrated in a cloud of rumor and speculation over Dusty's crush on 8th grader Miranda Caponelli, I knew the signs. Evenings, Dad and I ate and washed dishes, then returned to the labyrinth where the walls grew higher by night, the maze deeper, and the animal carcasses, when we found them, more savaged. Squirrels unbellied, birds beheaded and de-winged, water moccasins balloon-animaled into knots. In time, we hit chain link, bulldozed it, then hit chain link again. We were deep into government property. White signs nailed to trees warned in New Testament read of fines and jail time for trespassers, and we knocked the trees down, the trees and everything that lived in them. By then, we'd killed so many alligators. By then, we'd filled more than our requisite 10 acres. Still, most days, Tory stayed near the house so that the back acres went untouched and footprint-free. I wondered what my father was trying to prove, building a maze to nowhere, but we pressed on through the 100-degree days of summer and into autumn. The mosquitoes were unbearable. At night, Dad drew warm baths laced with skin so soft, then put me to bed, tattooed calamine lotion pink. Some nights, I stood at my window which faced the labyrinth and watched the tops of our walls for the curve of horn that meant our minotaur was on the move. But, like most animals that aren't man, he mostly slept. Night and day, rising only to eat or play or walk the maze with me. He didn't like to walk the maze alone. Dad continued to build, but the water grew deep, the land inhospitable. A laborer was bitten by a coral snake, another by a copperhead, and soon no day laborers would join Dad in the messy work of draining lakes or plugging the mouths of sinkholes with cement. Finally, reluctantly, Dad erected the back wall in red brick. Having gone as far as we could, the labyrinth now 15, 16 acres, I thought that we were finished, but we weren't. We'd reached the end, Dad said, but not the beginning. Now, we'd move into phase 2. flank the house on either side, and fill up our considerable front yard, that long walk down the driveway, house to road, so that our home would no longer serve as the gatehouse for the maze, but its nucleus. Nucleus was a word I'd learned that fall in science class, and while I didn't understand its exact function in relationship to a cell, I knew that no way should it be what a home was in relationship to a demigod's maze. Briefly, Dad considered buying the plot of land across the street, extending the labyrinth in that direction via tunnels beneath the road or bridges above, but already he was out of money and deep into home equity loans. No one had to ask whether I still had a college fund. At Thanksgiving dinner, Dad announced his plans for Phase 2, and Mom moved out. Take me with you, I wanted to say, but I didn't. Mom had work and friends, but Dad had only me. I couldn't leave him alone with his maze. Couldn't leave Tori alone with my father, who was forgetting more and more to feed and water my friend. Afternoons, fresh off the school bus, I'd run to the labyrinth, where sometimes Tori's trough would stand empty, algae slick and sun-guzzled, the bull man in the grass passed out, his nose dry. Days like these emboldened, I yelled at my father, who let the yells go past him or else through him, in and out of ears like the tongues of snakes. Help me, he'd say, offering me a hammer or a nail or a board to hold, and I said no the last time. Enough, I said. The labyrinth, Tori doesn't even use it. It's enough. I should have anticipated what came next. The next day, I returned from school and found the maze doors open. I called for Tori. He didn't come. I heard hammering and moved to the sides of the house. Tori stood untethered, hauling 2x4s from the bed of my father's truck. A skeleton of new maze was taking shape, a frame of beams across the grass, Dad in a lawn chair, PBR in hand. Tori looked tired. His eyes lolled in their long lashed sockets. All day I knew he'd worked while Dad directed and drank beer. Tori panted, great clots of drool foaming cappuccino white from his chin and down his chest. My father had his shirt off, though it was cold, hurricane season having surrendered to an early winter chill. Rumor had it that in 2 days it might snow, the first time such a thing had happened this far south since the year of my birth. Worse yet, the forecasters predicted a freeze, the first since 1895. That freeze had killed so many orange trees that farmers had traded citrus permanently for celery. Oviedo would go on to become the self-proclaimed celery capital of the world, a dubious distinction to be sure, except that isn't any distinction better than never to have been known? There were days I wonder whether this is why my father did it, why Dad drained our savings and built the labyrinth. Maybe he wanted to be known as the man who tamed the Minotaur. Maybe he'd hoped to land our family on the nation's cryptozoological map. Whatever the case, with his shirt off in the cold, beer in hand, and Tori pulling beams from the truck, I wasn't thinking about my father in that way just then. No, I was thinking about how passion can make a man cruel, or else how cruelty can look an awful lot like passion. Or maybe they're two sides of the same diabolical coin. Tori's legs shook, his forearms red from the press of lumber all day long. Come on, I said. My father didn't fight me, didn't protest as I led the Minotaur away. We reached the maze doors and Tori's tail wagged. We stopped inside and he got down on all fours. A pigeon carcass lounged in the grass, and Tori nudged it toward my shoe with his great black nose. He stood, and if a bull can smile, I swear that he did. And right then, the whip came down. Tori howled. He spun, and I saw the lattice of his back. It was so like his legs, only these marks hadn't been put there by the rough corners of the labyrinth walls. I turned, and it was my father. He held a whip the way a lion tamer would. The day Mom left, he'd stopped shaving, and his mustache had thickened into beard. He smiled, and his smile was nothing like the Minotaur's. There followed a second crack of whip, and Tori bellowed and ran, snorting, into the maze. I stood before my father, daring him with tear-filled eyes to try the whip on me, but he only returned to the side of the house, where he unloaded the remainder of wood from the bed of his truck alone. I slept fitfully that night, and following a day searching the maze for Tori and unable to find him, I slept fitfully the next night too. Deep into that second night, I woke to a scream. Or maybe I thought it was the nightmare of a scream. The phone was ringing, and I went to the kitchen to answer it. "Are you all right?" my mother said. Her voice was more tender than I remembered, as though time away from us had done her good. I imagined her at work with her hygienist friends. I imagined her in the oral surgeon's lap. That week, my period had come at last, and with it, feelings I didn't quite know what to do with. Imaginings that made my stomach hurt, which I also couldn't quite control. I'd picture Tori, then picture him above me, his bull nose wet against my ear or nuzzling my breast the way a piglet looks for milk. I'd remember that loincloth, and then I would warm and currents would run electric down my legs. I wondered if it was like this for my father. Not these imaginings, but the urge. The intensity of a thing you didn't want to feel and feeling couldn't help. We're all slaves to our longings. Our wishes go ungranted, or else they're fulfilled, and either way we're slaves to them. My mother, on the phone, her voice in my ear, the minotaur in my dreams, that otherworldly sleep-evaporating scream, an echo in the back of my mind, this truth, the truth of want, struck me as commonplace, but no less profound for being commonplace. "The freeze," Mom said. "Are you and your father all right?" I looked past the window to the maze walls, blue with frost. The freeze had come. "I'm sorry I woke you," my mother said, when I said nothing. "You okay?" "We're fine," I said, and hung up the phone. My father wasn't in his room, and he wasn't on the couch where he sometimes fell asleep, the TV on, hand in a bag of microwave popcorn. I dressed in my warmest clothes and stepped into the backyard. The maze doors were open. That was the first thing I saw. A swath of lawn no wider than a dirt road divided the front of the maze from the back of our house. Between them, the pole Tori had once run around glowed silver-iced in moonlight. The trench he'd dug had grown back in, weedy, and the weeds roiled blue in the freeze. Our backyard orange tree leaned chiaroscuroed against the night, its fruit now frozen globes. I imagined an orange dropping and exploding like blown glass. I pulled on one, and ice needled my head. "Dad?" I called. I moved to the maze doors. "Dad!" I called again, my words an exhalation of white. My voice ricocheted, shot back at me from every wall. I knew the labyrinth for its reverberations, but frozen, it had become an echo chamber. I started in, but I didn't make it far before recognizing that if I pressed on, I'd be lost. The day before, looking for Tori, I'd walked the same corridors for hours, afraid to leave the lengths of maze closest to the house. I'd only ever walked a few acres with Tori, and now the maze was many acres deep, and if my father and the Minotaur were in there, if Dad had Tori working for him on this too cold night, I'd find them, but I had to be smart. I left the maze, and back home found a stash of my mother's abandoned dental floss in the bathroom drawer. I holstered these in one of Dad's tool belts, then walked to those parts of the maze I knew well. In time, I moved to less familiar corridors, unholstered my first reel of Oral-B Glide Pro Health Deep Clean Floss Cool Mint flavor, and tied off to the head of a nail protruding from the length of board. I started forward into the maze, the floss unspooling and sharp clicks at my side. When I reached the end of one spool, I tied it to the next and went on. I continued like this for what seemed hours, stopping every few minutes to stamp my feet against the cold. Often I would hit dead ends and have to backtrack, bundling my floss and carrying it with me along the way. Sometimes the floss would tangle hopelessly, and I would have to abandon one cartridge for another. Having begun with a dozen, I hadn't gone far before I was down to 3, then 2, then 1. I wandered and took in our long year's handiwork. The cinder block wing, the rooms of tree trunks grooved and fit together log cabin tight, the section of maze fashioned entirely from greenhouse glass. I saw all of this, and then I saw things I had not been shown before. A gun tower, a room of pipes cut and sanded to silver points, tripwires, barbed wire, lengths of razor wire unspooled savage along the ground. Everything was frozen, ice slicked and set aglow. One hall was narrow, walls fit with shards of broken glass. The glass was meaty, thick with gore and hair, and I knew my father had made the corridor just narrow enough. I climbed the tower. From there, I could see the labyrinth and all its sinister bends and undulations, and not far from where I stood, movement, a shadow dance projected on one wall. I memorized the route, descended the tower, and I ran. By now, I was out of floss, just running, weaving in and out of rooms, past walls of nails and walls of bones and walls triggered to spit fire as I ran past them. I ran, sobbing, tears freezing to my cheeks and shattering when I touched my face. I ran until, turning one corner, I found what I'd been seeking. In truth, I'd worried for my father's welfare, worried what Taurus, our Minotaur, harried and furious, might do if moved toward revenge. What chance did a man have in the face of a creature twice his size, a creature with 20 times my father's strength? But strength is no predictor of power. And so maybe I shouldn't have been surprised to find my father straddling the body, the Minotaur, a piñata cracked and gut splashed in the grass. The head here, the body there, a sword between. It was then I knew how a mother feels sending a son or a daughter to war, how Abraham felt leading the boy up the mountain, how a stage magician feels watching a tiger turn another man's face to meat. I hadn't believed my father capable of such a thing, but of course he'd been capable of it. Of this and of more, and I think I knew this, had known it. Who, after all, had turned all those animals monstrous, the turtles and the snakes, the birds and squirrels? Not Tory, not our Minotaur, who'd spent his short life railing against his given nature, even as my father was giving in to his. I'd wished against this kind of heart for my father, and in wishing made him in my mind into the man I'd wanted to believe he was. But wishing doesn't keep a person from becoming what he is. And I wondered then if my mother knew this, if she'd known this, if this was why she left. And wondering this, I wondered how, in the name of love, she could have left me there with him. I don't know where my father got the sword. Scimitar in hand, he stood shirtless, his back to me, skin blue, breath coming out in plumes, but not shivering, hardly moving, so that had I not detected the pulse of a vein in his neck, I might have believed him carved from stone. And then the stone turned. My face, by now, was ice from all the tears. I imagined my eyes, unable to spill over, freezing in their sockets. A hammer hung from the tool belt at my waist, and I raised it. I shook so hard the hammer seemed made from putty, as in that childhood illusion you learn in school. The one where pencil or pen between two fingers, you jiggle it to make it look rubber-like. My father didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He raised his sword. But he hadn't raised it high before she was on him. My mother, like lightning or like love. I don't know how she'd found us, only she was there. The hammer fell from my hands, and my mother fell against my father, and the two of them fell over the body of the Minotaur, then stood, my father's back pressed to a wall, his sword dropping, and they held each other, the two of them locked in a wrestler's hug. And then the hug was feet and teeth and fists. And from out of the tangle, out of the labyrinth my parents were building with their bodies, I heard a word, a single word, before those bodies hit the ground. It was my mother's word, and the word was run. But I didn't run. Not yet. I watched. And as I watched, the beings that had spawned me, loved me, taken their turns leaving me, I watched them ruin each other's bodies in front of me. They fought, and they fought, and I think that it was my mother's thumb, at last, that thumb sunk to the knuckle in the jelly of my father's eye that told me that their place was here, that they would not be leaving the labyrinth. Not tonight, and not ever. That in a few days, when the men came to take the walls away, and when the other men came to reclaim the land, it would be like that nursery rhyme my mother had so often recited to me as a child. The one in which, excepting their nails and the tips of their tails, instead of two cats, there weren't any. Yes, like that rhyme. Just like it. With nothing left, nothing to find, nothing of my parents, and nothing of the Minotaur, who was no longer a Minotaur now, just the head of a bull severed, a bull head in the body of a man, so that in time no one would believe that the Minotaur had been among us, or had ever even been nothing in the end, save a certain curve of horn, given to a woman so young, some might have called her still a girl. And though the horn would not be a ram's horn, the girl would go on to fashion a shofar from it. And though the sound it made when blown would not be beautiful, not beautiful at all, it would be mysterious, and it would be rich, and it would be sad, and it would bring good fortune to any listener who heard it, and heard it well. That sound. It would be the music of the gods. Thank you. Thank you. So let's talk about happy things. I'm very happy to answer any questions about writing, about anything about how Barry used to be 13 years ago. I believe Dr. Meek has a microphone.
Could you tell us about your routine as a writer? How you get most of your content?
Sure. I used to have a routine, and then I had children. When I started grad school at the University of Arizona, I made a commitment to myself to write for a couple hours every day, and most days I did write anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. When I had children, I didn't have that luxury anymore, but I still try to write as much as I can, whenever I can. I think that, I wasn't writing as an undergraduate, but I mean, certainly if you're here, if you're studying, if you're writing, write as much as you can. But the other thing I was telling students, I met with 3 classes today, and my best advice is just read. Read as much as you can. Certainly keep writing, but read, and read well, and read widely.
Did you ever did you think about being a writer while you were in college? And then two, how did you get started after deciding?
Oh, sure. It's interesting. I came to this. I don't know. Okay. Here's a long answer to a short question. I started Barry as a communications major. Then I became an art major. And then I became an English major. And the only creative writing class I took at Berry was poetry. So I wasn't writing fiction here, but I was reading a lot, and I was exposed to a lot of great fiction by Dr. Meek, by Dr. Watkins, by a number of my professors. And I think that over the course of the next 4 years after Berry, while I taught high school, I was just reading as much as I could and writing in the summers. And when it got to the point that I was writing in the summers and wasn't fulfilled by that and wanted to be writing all the time, I knew I needed to make a change. So, what I would say is if you already want to be a writer and you're already writing, then you're way ahead of the game where I was when I was here. And so that's a great thing. Sure.
Well, this is a very unique kind of story, so I want to know inspiration.
I'm sorry? Yeah. Can you say it again?
This is a very unique story. I want to know what the inspiration behind it with the mythical picture.
Oh, thank you. I've always been interested in myth, in books and stories that kind of like to rewrite myths. Ulysses, for example, Ian Joyce's kind of revision of the Odyssey. And I liked this myth of the Minotaur. It's such a weird myth. A woman who, what's a nice way of putting it, makes love to a bull and has this half-man, half-bull child, and then there's the story of Theseus and Ariadne and the string, and I knew it was going to get a little wacky, but I didn't know how weird I could make it, and so I just decided to go for it, I've been working on a novel for 4 years. It's a pretty serious novel, and it deals with a lot of difficult issues, and I really did need a release valve for that, and so I've started writing a lot of weird stories. In the collection, there are a couple of weird ones, but they're very short. There's a short one about a glowing baby. There's a short one about a talking wolf, and I was like, but I've been a great admirer of writers like Karen Russell and Amy Bender, and these writers who can take a weird conceit like that and not dispense with 3 or 4 pages, but really run with it and write a full-length story with it. And so I thought, I like the myth of the Minotaur. I wonder if I could bring that to present-day Oviedo, Florida. And Oviedo is where I live, so I already kind of had the landscape in my head and the myth, and then I thought, how can I have fun with that and then make Berry students have to listen to it?
I enjoyed this story that you did, but do you have other genres that you prefer to write in?
Well, I do more realist literary fiction, and then I do this sort of fabulist or magic realist literary fiction. So far, all I've got is the first collection and a novel in the works. Yeah.
So, writing a story from the perspective of a girl, do you feel like you changed your language at all? And also, are you thinking that your voice with thoughts that you got along the way?
Well, I sort of cheated a little. The one way in which I cheated is by telling the story in past tense, I got to have that kind of retrospective look. So I got to use, because I really wanted to use the kind of lyrical language that I felt like a myth deserved, and I couldn't do that if I was stuck in the girl's voice. I didn't want to do like a kind of Holden Caulfield thing. So having a retrospective narrator allowed me to just write from, really it's from a woman's point of view, if you think about it that way. And I've never found it that difficult to write from, other genders, sexualities, ethnicities. I think that if you embrace the voice and just write them as human, it comes across. I hope it did. Maybe it didn't. Yeah.
When you first started writing, what was some of the authors or books that inspired you to go through the novels?
Oh, sure. I'm a huge lover of Virginia Woolf, so Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse are two of my all-time favorites. In terms of the short story genre, I read a lot of American writers. Raymond Carver was a big influence. John Updike was a big influence. More currently, living writers, Lori Moore, Ron Carlson, Karen Russell, ZZ Packer, Rick Bass, Ethan Kanan. I'm just going to stop there. I mean, I could rattle off a lot of writers, but yeah, the short story form is probably my favorite form at this point in my life to write in.
Well, that's the eccentric to the story. There are definitely some beautiful ones too. So what's beautiful to you and why do you like it?
What's beautiful to me?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. I mean, to take the easy way out, though, it's true. I mean, love is the most beautiful thing to me, and so I think the majority of my stories are about family and about love, but I tend to write toward what scares me, and so I like to write about sort of love unfulfilled, love unrequited, the kind of ways in which we hurt the people we love. Because if you think about it, you can be hurt by a stranger. You can have someone on the street tell you, they don't like you, and it hurts for a day. But it's the kind of things we do to each other, the people we know, the people in our family, the people we love, those are the ones that stick with you. And so there's this weird thing in which the people we're going to hurt most in our lives are those we love the most, and often without even meaning to. And so for me, a beautiful thing is trying to get at the heart of that hurt, of why we can't love better and how we can try to be better people while, we have this short time on earth.
Any other questions?
How he meant to be seeing more of the monster than
Yeah, thank you. I guess so. For the story took a long time to write, and it didn't really come together for me until toward the end, when I decided to push for that inversion. So the Minotaur starts off as monstrous and becomes more human over the course of the story. The father starts as human and becomes more monstrous over the story. And once I saw that's where sort of the story came together for me. I do get asked a lot about the symbolism in my stories. What does the alligator mean? Or as a couple students asked me today, what does the shirt mean in this particular story? And I guess as the writer, I'm the wrong person to answer. I don't know what things mean in my stories. What I do when I write, and this is how you can tell you're talking to a fiction writer and not like a lit crit guy, is, I just throw a bunch of stuff in the story, and I like to see the way things stick to each other, and sometimes they don't, and they leave, and sometimes they do, and they stay, and how that all comes out for the reader is up to the reader's interpretation. I've had plenty of people tell me how they interpret different stories of mine, and they ask if they're right, and I always say yes. So,
last question. Well, the way that you talked about your home in Florida and kind of how that surfaces the study for such a story that went to different places. Do you think you have in one particular place that really did a lot for your writing in the landscape or that environment?
yeah, absolutely. I do tend to write pretty far away from myself. I have a pretty stable life. I'm in a happy marriage. I have 2 great kids, not a lot of drama, and that's the way I like it. But that makes lousy fiction. So I have to write toward conflict. And it's hard to make up characters, make up conflict, and then make up a setting. So all of my stories tend to be set in places I know well. And there's something about anchoring my fiction with places I love that I can then drop imaginary characters into them and let them walk around for a while and see what they're going to do. So in this collection, I have stories set in Tucson and Kentucky and Cincinnati and Atlanta and Florida, all places where I've lived. And just when I don't know where to go, I just start by describing the places as I know them. In the novel, I've just finished the first draft of. It's set on a lake in North Carolina that's suspiciously like the lake in North Carolina I spent my summers on as a boy. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming again. And we do have those for sale. Kat and Jamie will be downstairs signing them. And thank you.